Good day. Today is October 31st, Halloween, and the topic is China. As many of you may know, China or Chinese politics is not my beat. I look at China from the perspective of its policies, its international policies, and policies towards Africa. But I'm not conversant in Chinese, and I do not normally look at Chinese domestic politics. However, we've all watched the TV news, and we know that President Xi has anointed himself for life. And life in this case may be 10 years, even 20 years. And what is of interest to me is the appointments to what is the equivalent of his cabinet. You might again have seen on TV or the news that all the members that are now in his cabinet are beholden to him, are yes men, are on the same page he is in. And the two people who had slightly different ideas are gone. And the slightly different ideas in this case were people who were more pro-market rather than state control of the economy. And I will talk about that in a minute. So from a perspective of international economy, the fact that those two folks are no longer there is somewhat alarming. The other aspect from the American perspective and American negotiations, trade negotiations with China, is that the Chinese representative who negotiated with the US trade representative is also gone. So that also isn't particularly good news. One thing that is probably better news is that the Chinese ambassador to the United States has been recalled, and apparently he's going back to China in March, I believe. And why do I think that's good news? Well, if you're going to have to deal with the United States and you're China, if you have someone who is well connected in the bureaucracy in Washington, which a Chinese ambassador to the US would have been, and knows the US well, at least you have in the wider circle of advisors someone who is very familiar with the United States, familiar with the cast of characters. So I actually consider that a positive move. Now, the announcement, of course, from China has been that it will now focus more on centralized role of the economy. The great growth rate in China, economic growth rate, it's sometimes as high as 10% a year, 6% a year, 7, 8, 5, is currently very low. It's at 3 point something. So this is the worst Chinese economy has done in a long time. And the growth rate, the spectacular growth rate of the Chinese economy, and with it, of course, lots of power and influence in the world, came when private enterprise and market forces were wildly in control. So the Alibabas of this world, you may have noticed that Mr. Ma of Alibaba, who used to be interviewed on all American programs, etc., seems to be gone from the scene. It's not known whether he's dead or in prison or just been told to shut up. But the corporate executives of the large international relevant corporations that helped China put China on the economic map and help the economy grow. Those people are either gone or they've been made to be very quiet. And the announcement of during this conference that anointed Xi was that now the central government would take more control of the economy. Is this a good thing? For China, probably not. It will probably slow down the economy. Is this a good thing internationally? Probably not. Free enterprise on the whole was a good thing. Of course, from the perspective of the United States, it is also the case that we in the United States are also trying to rein in private enterprise, not by the state taking it over, but rather by trying to reduce the dependence of the U.S. economy on external trade, right? That is a way of pulling in as well by saying not the government will control private industry as is happening in China, but rather to say we want to repatriate many aspects of our economy to make us less dependent on the international system. And that in some senses could have a similar outcome. It is possible that, increasing American production in technology, in TVs and cars and so forth, is a good thing for the American economy, but it may not be a good thing for us, the consumers, because prices might actually get up. I've talked last time about sanctions and such and mentioned that in point of fact, reducing the idea that was prevalent during the globalization phase, that you had comparative advantage if, for example, you were able to produce something more cheaply than somebody else, then you could export it, or to put it in reverse, the US could export cheaper products because labor or the ingredients or the technological know-how was advanced somewhere. So in different ways, different governments are pulling in, including the Chinese, in terms of either having government control or at least trying to eliminate, which is also part, of course, of the Chinese mission, their dependence on other countries. Now, before one exaggerates this, let me remind you that China is the biggest trading partner for 120 countries in the world. And obviously, its economy needs that. And presumably, even when you have more government control, they're not going to try to disaggregate the trade and the investments of those countries. So it's a somewhat confusing picture at the moment, because while one can state and stipulate what the Chinese government says it's going to do, what the actual impact on the Chinese economy is going to be is less clear. It's also the case that the Chinese economy, in order to be very productive, needs the raw materials that come from the rest of the world, right? The various ingredients to make the computer world work, the various metals that are needed from other parts of the world. So while on the one hand, China is saying you're going to have more government control of Chinese industries, on the other hand, the Chinese government is, of course, continues to reach out and is keen on leaving its communications and efforts open to make sure that it has access to all the primary materials, raw materials that it needs to keep its economy humming. How this is all going to work out is unclear, and we have gotten the image over the years that the Chinese are just incredibly successful in every imaginable way. And now we learn that the Chinese economy is also slowing down, and that they're going to try new domestic economic policies. And how this all will work out, whether it will continue to strengthen China or actually weaken China, is really unclear. In the meantime, COVID, of course, has had an impact on all economies, including the Chinese economy. And the Chinese have not been able to deal very effectively with COVID through these major lockdowns. So I think rather than jumping to conclusions about what the new look of China may be under the new dictums handed down at this last major meeting in China, one should imagine that there's some gray terrain there. We don't exactly know, and I don't think the Chinese exactly know how this is all going to work out. Will China continue to strengthen its domestic economy? Will there be political opposition? How would it deal with it? And how will it impact the rest of the world? I think there are more unknowns than the sort of media and the press have reported, because essentially the media and the press have just emphasized the sort of more authoritarian and dictatorial aspects of the Chinese as they're moving more and more to centralized control. And in general, it is, I think, accurate to say that centralized control doesn't always work as well as advertised. So it's in a way an open question. And from the US perspective, I think that one needs to take a wait and see attitude of how this is going to play out in terms of policy, political, as well as economic. There are some other aspects which I think is slightly more or equally alarming. One of them is that the Chinese Xi has gotten together yet again with Putin to strengthen the alliance. And say, you know, we are in support of each other and against the West and the United States and the Ukraine. So that has been that sort of link seemingly has been strengthened. It's even more alarming that Putin and Xi have discussed that they're going to cooperate more and unite more in the United Nations, in the Security Council, and the special agencies to get their way. And there, I mean, it's a different subject than today, but their alarm bells should be rung, because one of the reasons the Security Council can't do anything terribly useful about any events in the world right now, much less the Ukraine, is that the Russians have a veto, and of course the Chinese have a veto as well. And so far, on not all the resolutions, but on some, the Russians have vetoed resolutions, and the Chinese have simply not voted. It may very well be that the Chinese and the Russians now both veto various Security Council resolutions, or that they'll, you know, play each other. One will do it one time, one will do it another. But the effectiveness of the United Nations, both in the specialized agencies that I don't want to talk about today, as well as in New York, is being very much reduced by the Russian-Chinese antagonism towards the West and wanting to, you know, stop any kind of action on the part of the West. This will get very heated when we're talking about human rights, because, of course, the Russians are violating all kinds of crimes against humanity and so forth. And it will be very difficult for the UN system to deal with this in any way whatsoever, as long as the Chinese and Russians, either or and both, sit on various committees, sit on are controlling, have power in various specialized UN agencies, etc. So I think it is noteworthy that after Xi, renewed his power, that the Russians and the Putin got together once again, saying that they are going to cooperate. From the perspective of other countries, there are also interesting things playing itself out. For example, as long as the Chinese will say, well, we're not going to import, let's say, from the West, and we can either gear up our own production of things or commence more effective productions. You have some European countries in economic difficulty. For example, the German economy is heavily dependent on its exports of machinery, of, God knows, washing machines, refrigerators, all kinds of things, high-end machinery to China. And if China, as a customer, slows down its purchases from Germany, either in order to object to the EU and its policies in the Ukraine, or as part of its strategy of producing more things domestically that used to be imported, the German economy will be in difficulty. And as we know, the German economy is the strongest economy in the EU. So this is not just a matter of US and China. This is not just a matter of China and international institutions and the post-World War II framework, which both Russia and China are trying to erode, of things having to do with human rights, having to do with welfare of various sorts. But this, can impact the viability of certainly the German economy and to some extent some others. So there's sort of spin-offs of, and I must say, the spin-offs, the degree of the spin-offs are unknown. I mean, in the German press, there's already alarm about exports to Germany. Whether these alarms will come to fruition or not, and to what degree and how fast is not clear. But on the one hand, China is this world power, right? Both economically, politically, and in terms of the Belt and Road structures that go all through various countries. On the other hand, there is a certain amount of interdependencies that has developed that if they are unwound, which they haven't totally yet, might have a serious impact on the economies of the United States and Western Europe. So stay tuned on that. Then there's the military part. China has, in the last few years, geared up its military. One of the interesting things about China in the decades past was that it had a very low level of military spending. Yes, it had warships, yes, it had planes and so forth, but the proportion of its economy, its budget that went into military was relatively low given the size of the country and increasingly economy. That has changed over the last few years. In part, the explanation is to gear up on any kind of future conflict in Taiwan or the China Sea. But it's even beyond that. And the noises that have come out of China in the last few weeks is that even more emphasis will be given on the military might of China. That is not good news for the region. Not merely because one thinks that the Chinese will send missiles and planes and so forth all over Southeast Asia, but because its might give it some more leverage over some of the countries which are fairly weak, and may also have the impact of really scaring Japan, which is an ally of the US, right? And you don't want somebody in the area with a kind of military, Air Force, shipping at sea, mining capacity, and so forth in your region, declaring that in this decade it is going to be building up more of its military might. And while this is not all just news of the last few weeks, I thought I would call attention to it because it does lend a kind of new dynamic to the big power aspect of China. China's economic might has been clear for some time, but its military might and its interest in its own military might has been ratcheted up, and that's scary for everybody concerned. Then there is the sort of sideshow, which I alluded to, which is if the Chinese economy is going to gear up domestically and reduce its linkages internationally, then it might also need additional international resources to achieve this. And there one can notice in the last 2 or 3 years, not just this year, that China increasingly is shopping around for access to minerals and so forth in countries that heretofore it had either no links or modest links. And the continent that's most impacted by that right now is the African continent, where the Chinese are busy shopping and trying to make agreements for mining in places like the Congo and other countries in the world, which are known to have mineral resources, potentially gas and oil resources, and making sure that it has alliances and access to these resources and deprives the United States and Western countries from competing having access. So the Chinese outreach, in a sense, to make its more sort of self-contained economy and government-controlled economy has accelerated and is accelerating, and that's worth watching internationally. Now, I don't want to exaggerate here. China, of course, is still going to be a big trading country for some time to come, both in terms of its own interests and the interest of anybody else. But given its increasing centralization and the leverage that the central government is trying to play, it also means that China is in a very good position to violate the trading agreements and trading protocols that have developed over the years. So, for example, the World Trade Organization, of which China is a member, it used to be thought that it was a good idea to have China a member of the World Trade Organization. Well, okay, there it is. But there are many other members. China may very well either veto or, for that matter, even destroy the effectiveness of the World Trade Organization by saying, we're a major power here, and we're not interested in these trade agreements. And we're going to throw a monkey wrench not only in the Security Council in the United Nations and other UN agencies, but agencies, far-flung agencies, more far-flung agencies like the World Trade Organization, perhaps some of the international organizations I've talked about in the past, having to do with outer space, having to do with open sea, having to do with their resources, by the way, in the deep oceans, and their protocols and institutionalized international law about how to treat the resources in the open sea. Well, China, if it needs to start violating this or trying to destroy these agreements, I guess what I'm saying is we're in somewhat new waters, somewhat scary waters. And I think the fact that Chinese economy is in some difficulty is not to be celebrated, but is to be scared of. Because when countries are in difficulty and the population is in difficulty post-COVID, when you have increasing unemployment, which China has right now, when you have the demographic challenges that China is currently engaged in, I'll pause in a minute and talk about that, countries act irrationally, and if they don't act irrationally, they act in self-interested ways which may harm not only other countries, but may in fact harm the international order that everybody has gotten used to, and the international law that is in everybody's interest. I'm not suggesting, by the way, the U.S. doesn't violate international law nowadays, but it does so by and large modestly or in small amounts. But this could get somewhat out of control. Now, the irony of this situation is that one of the things that China is lacking is population. The population in China is very old, it's aging. The one-child policy of the years gone back has reduced the population of various age groups, and the move away on the part of China from one-child policy has not led to women having more children. So China is facing in this century serious demographic issues, which means it probably will have to import labor. And if it has to import labor, will it be easy to attract labor? And if it attracts labor, what will it do in Chinese society? These are interesting questions worth considering down the road. But at the moment, the interesting question is, on the one hand, you have unemployment in China because the economy has slowed down in the short term. But even in the medium term, China will lack population. And as China is pulling in, and pulling in terms of centralization and self-focus, the U.S. is doing some odd things, which I don't think will help U.S.-China policy, which is our immigration policy, which I will talk about some other time, which is a veritable nightmare these days, has done, among other things, reduced the number of Chinese studying in the United States, both at the undergraduate and graduate level, and has reduced the number of visas available to Chinese scientists, academics, and all the rest. This is very short-sighted, because if one is looking for people in the Chinese bureaucracies, in Chinese academia, that are influenced by Western values to some extent, Western knowledge, linkages with Westerners, and one is reducing this on the American side, this is very bad policy for us, because we will lose the contacts in China that we used to have in the liaisons with Chinese in various enterprises, because they have linkages due to their work life in the US or due to their having been academics in US institutions. On this later point, we've become, we meaning the United States, so paranoid that we have taken and accused various Chinese academics at various Chinese universities for wrongdoing and selling information to their country of origin, China, and so forth. There may have been one or two spies somewhere, but clearly it has come to light that some of the Chinese scholars, some of the Chinese researchers working in the United States have been falsely accused. So from an American perspective, we can look askance at China, and we can look askance at the centralization and the dictatorship and authoritarianism. But I think we should be very careful that we don't respond the way we have been responding in terms of decoupling from China ourselves, because I would argue that this is not in our long-term interest. So as sort of negative a press as what's happening in China has gotten, and in many ways justifiable, I think we in the United States would be well poised to be careful, to tread water a little bit, not to overreact, not to go into some big China bashing mode, not to cut us off from links with individual Chinese and Chinese workers and scholars and so forth. Because at the end of the day, even the Russian illustration shows us that having knowledgeable people, knowledgeable Americans in Russia, Russians living in the United States, knowledgeable about Russia and so forth, is actually in the interest of US foreign policy. So I think China bashing is not a good idea. Being critical of what's going on in a measured way is a good idea. A democratic country does not want to or should not fail to comment on authoritarianism elsewhere. But I think good diplomacy and some caution should be carefully deployed here, because no matter what we do, China will be the major leading, most populous, or next to most populous, next to India country in the world in this century, and we are a shrinking component. And so I think the better part of wisdom on the United States is to be well informed, but also to be cautious and not to overreact at this moment in American-Chinese relations, and not to overreact in terms of what's playing itself out in China, but to take something of a wait-and-see attitude. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.